Welcome. Today we're going to talk about washes and how you can use them, and not the least, how you mix them. In one of my previous videos, I was showing a type of kind of unusual way of using washes. I'm using it under and over glazes to alter them and create some new and interesting things. A lot of you saw that video, but I kind of jumped over how I actually do the washes. So I will be focusing on that in this video. It's not going to be as long as many of my other videos, but I think you'll get a clear picture of how you can mix washes and how you can use them. So, welcome. Just to clarify a few things before we start. I know there can be a lot of confusion with words in the pottery business. Washes and stains and oxides and carbonates and underglazes and engrobes and what is it all? For the purpose of this video, a wash is how I define it. Lots of potters define it that way. It's a very diluted colorant. So down to something that is really just like a watercolor you would use for watercolor paintings. So a strong colorant, but diluted down with a lot of water. That's the basic of a wash. The most common use of washes is to highlight grooves and textures in pottery. So here somewhere you can see an example of how I washed in a Copper Carbonate wash into the grooves or the textures of this pot before I applied the glaze. And that kind of highlights those textures. It's a very common way of using it. But what I also do a lot is to use the washes to alter existing glazes. So even if you're using commercial glazes or mixing your own glazes based on recipes that anybody else also can do, you can change the appearance of those glazes by altering them with these washes and create something that is truly unique. It's sort of like painting, except for someone like me that is a terrible painter. It's more like abstract playing with colors. And I really like the things you can do with that. If you're one of the few that didn't see the video about how I use Oxides washes under and over glazes, there's a link somewhere here, and also I'll put it in the description. So I encourage you to watch that. I think the outcome was very interesting. So basically, when we are dealing with washes, or I'm dealing with washes, it's a combination of some sort of a colorant and a lot of water. I like to mix them up in these little glasses. They are very tight, so they don't evaporate so much. It's just a nice and safe way to keep it, because they are very strong colorants, so you definitely don't want them in a pot that can somehow leach in. It'll just distort everything. Today we're gonna do some washes that are based on some of my favorite and most common colorants. Red Iron Oxide. Yeah, you can see it here. Red Iron Oxide is very widely available, and it's rather cheap. It has a very strong colorant. Ranges typically from brown, reddish, and to dark and black. And then we have Copper Carbonate, which is also one of my favorite. It's typically it will be green. I'll get back to the colors a little bit later. And then I forgot to put a label on this because it's so new. It's chrome oxide, also green, but a different kind of green. You can almost see the difference here. And the cobalt carbonate, which is not as widely available. Some pottery stores have stopped selling it. It is toxic. You should be careful with it. and it is awful expensive, but it's also a very, very strong colorant. So here's a kilo that I bought recently for, I think it's $150, something like that. That's gonna last me a few years, so it's okay. Per pot, it's not that expensive. There's a wide range of colorants you can use to create washes. I like to use oxides because they're strong, or carbonates. They're strong colorants and very reliable. I know how they react to different temperatures and atmosphere. But you can also use stains. A lot of people use that wide range of different kinds of stains. Mxing stains is probably the most well-known, have a huge selection. But there are also other non-branded stains that your pottery store may have that will probably work just as well. I don't know where they get them from, but they work great for me. But you can also use just clay. If you have a colored clay, like a very high iron clay, very red clay, or a dark clay, or whatever clay you want to use, or you can use other chemicals. Just try it out. There's really no danger. Worst thing, it looks awful, or it doesn't do anything, and then you just try again. Of course, I wouldn't take your favorite pots and apply it to the first time, although I sometimes do because I'm stupid. But yeah, that's another discussion. But I hate test tiles. I like to see it on a real pot. I don't know if you like me, but I think the test tiles never come out the same way as a real pot do. So I like to apply my testings to real pot. Of course, I don't do it on my big favorite ones, but I make a lot of small bowls or cups or even small vases, and I try that because that way I can see how it works on some sort of a scale. I think that's better for me anyway. The problem with washes in general, that goes for stains as well, or oxides as well in their raw form, is that they are they get influenced by the way you fire and other chemicals. Like all the other chemicals, if you fire them to a higher degree, they can change color. If you fire in oxidation versus reduced atmosphere, they can change color. So you can't rely on the color that you see. It's a little bit different when we're working with stains because they're compounds that have been in capsules, sometimes in zinc crystals, sometimes in other crystals, to kind of keep the color. So you can rely more on the color. And for some of the newer ones, they can also fire to high temperatures without actually changing color. But when it comes to oxides and carbonates, they're very reactive to whatever way you fire them. So you have to do your own experiments depending on the clay, the fire schedules, the type of fire you do. They may come out different. But then again, when you find out how they come out in a certain temperature and a certain atmosphere, it's very reliable, and then we do that every single time. So basically, the wash is the colorant plus border. But this is not unlike underglazes and glazes. It's not a glaze. It won't melt out in itself. So sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to make it attached to the clay. You can use washes in many ways. The way that I usually use them is under and over other glazes to alter how they look. But if you use them on just bisqueware and fire them, you don't have to put a glaze over or under it. It can be really nice and kind of raw if you just use it. For example, the iron oxide, if you use that as a wash and just put it on a textured surface, wash it off, and just fire it like that, it can look really, really nice. But the problem is you can have problem that the attachment to the clay, and also it won't melt out at all. So to try and help with that, even though I mostly use it in addition to glazes, you can add a little bit of a flux to help it melt out. I'm using I only do cone 6 firing, and for that Gersteley Borate is a nice flux to use. But you can also use like a Frit 3124. If you fire to higher temperatures, it may be a different flux you want to use. I don't do that for my stoneware, so you'll have to look that up. The problem when you mix when you mix oxides and water is that it's basically a heavy metal and water. So it's just going to sink almost immediately to the bottom. So you have to mix it up over and over again to have it sustained somehow. So you get more than just the water. To try and combat that a little bit, you can add some clay. I like to use EPK, a kaolin, porcelain powder, to sustain the suspend the particles into the water. It will sort of help it flow into the water so it doesn't sink as fast. It will eventually sink, but it's easier to keep it suspended. So how much should you use? How much oxide, how much the other ingredients, and how much water? Well, it doesn't really matter that much. I mean, normally if you would mix a glaze, it would be very important, you know, how many percentage of each ingredient. But that's because they are reacting much more to each other. In this case, there's actually very little reaction. It is the colorant. The water is just to dilute it and make it easier to apply without being too thick. The Gersteley Borate, the Frit, or the Frit, is just a flux that helps it melt a little bit. So, I mean, of course, if you put more flux in, it will melt out more. If you put less, it will help out, melt out less, but it's not so important. And of course, the EPK is just helping suspend the particles in water. So what I do for the application that I'm doing, I'm adding 1 part colorant, half a part each of the EPK and the Gersteley Borate. And I'm just using a spoon because, again, it doesn't have to be that accurate. So let's try and start with the copper carbonate. So I'm just going to take a spoonful of the copper carbonate and a spoonful of the EPK, or actually half a spoonful of the EPK. And again, it doesn't have to be very accurate. So just something like that. And half a spoonful of the Gersteley Borate. Something like this. Now we only need to add water. So how much water? Again, it doesn't actually matter so much. You just want it to be diluted enough to be like a watercolor. It should be very diluted. It should be almost like just colored water. When you apply washes, and it goes whether you apply it on top or under a glaze or just put it by itself with nothing else, you want enough color to actually have an effect, of course. If you water it down with, like, if I put 2 liters of water in this and try and paint it on, there wouldn't be any colorants left. So it wouldn't actually leave any impact. But in my experience, it's actually better to have less than more, because, for example, if you take the copper carbonate, if you add a lot of it, it's a very thick layer. It doesn't actually have to be that much, but if it's a thick layer, it will be black. And that's not really what I wanted with the copper carbonate. And even worse, if it's too thick a layer, you can get these little crusty, kind of unpleasant artifacts. I don't like that. So I would rather mix it up as a very light. You can see now it is almost like water. Just make sure that it's well mixed. And that's it. Now it's ready. I could have mixed a little bit more, but I think this is good enough for now. The good thing about keeping it in these glasses is that it can last forever. There's nothing in these materials that will degrade over time, so it can last forever. The only thing is, of course, even with a tight sealed lid, some of the water still may evaporate over time, and then you can just add some more water. It's very easy. So that was the copper carbonate. Now I just want to clean up my tools, my table a little bit. And then we can move on to the next one. So the next one will be the Red Iron Oxide. This is also one of my favorites, and also because it very often plays really well with the glazes I'm using, like the Folk Art White Gilt, one of my favorite glazes, have a lot of iron oxide in it. Or a Timoko Gold that I'm using also have a lot of iron oxide. And the clay that I'm using also have a lot of iron oxide in it. Of course, it's not as concentrated as the wash we're going to make, but by adding this to the textures or just to paint certain things, I've done that a lot with some of my bowls. You can see an example here, I think, if I put it in, how I add some strokes with a fan brush, and then I put the glaze on top. It actually creates some very nice variations to it. So this is definitely one of my favorites. And the fact is that it is super cheap and you can get it almost anywhere. So we're going to take a little bit of a bigger spoonful for this. So this, and we'll do the same thing with the Gersteley Borate and the EPK. The reason also I'm using EPK is that it has no color. So it doesn't affect the coloring at all. You have to remember that normally in a glaze, just a second. Normally in a glaze, you would only have like a few percent of these strong colorants in it. But in this case, it's like 50%. So it's very, very strong colored. And even if the EPK or Gersteley Borate theoretically could add a little bit of a color to it, it doesn't do anything in reality. So now we have the two components mixed here, or three. We will add water. And again, just mixing it. Yeah, this actually needs a little bit more water. I also used a bigger spoonful. But again, this is very easy to do because unlike glazes, you don't have to be so concerned with the exact mix. If when you start applying it, it turns out that it's becoming too thin, just add some more powder. Just add more colorant. If it's too thick, wipe it off and add some more water. It is like, as I said, I'm not a painter, but I assume that working with watercolors and doing paintings is sort of the same. There's no objective way to measure how much water you should put into your watercolors. Just play with it. And if you want a very diluted color, background color or something, you put a lot of water in it. Same thing for this. So now this is mixed as well. And of course, now I forgot with the first one here, with the Copper Carbonate wash, you should always label them. Because, I mean, these two, it's easy enough to see this must be copper, this must be red iron oxide. But what about when we start mixing the chrome? And maybe you mix other variants and it becomes very difficult to see. So please put a label on. Now that was the two colors. I could go on and mix the rest of them, but I don't think it serves any purpose. Now you see what I do, the basic ingredients. I will put the recipe down in the description as well. One thing I do want to mention is that there's tons of oxides and carbonates. Oxides is a chemical. You can find most of them in the periodic table: iron, cobalt, chrome, so on. And the cobalt oxide is an oxidated version of that. The cobalt carbonate is made in a bit of a different way. I'm no chemist, so not even going to try and explain everything about that. But generally speaking, you could say that the carbonates is a little weaker than the oxides. But in terms of using them for washes, it doesn't really matter if you use one or the other. Because when you use the carbonate and you heat it up to a certain temperature, it will be oxidated and it actually turns into an oxide anyway. So chemically speaking, coloring speaking, there shouldn't be any difference for this purpose. There may be in other applications. Again, I'm no chemist, but I'm just saying how it actually works for you and me. So there's a whole range of oxides. You can also use stains. Mxing stains is probably the most well-known brand, but there are also other kinds of stains, and some pottery shops have them, like call them body stains and clay colors or something. The only thing you have to be aware is that they're not all made for high temperatures. I'm only doing cone 6, so most of these stains will work well. But if you're firing cone 10 or even cone 14 wood firing, you certainly need to be sure that the stains can sustain that. Mxing stains was originally made for low temperature fires, so earthenware temperatures only about 1,000 degrees or something Celsius. But they have made other versions now. There's other versions available now that can take up to 1,300, I think even 1,350 degrees. I heard of people using them up to cone 14 in wood fire and got nice results. However, some of them may, as I said, change colors a lot. So you've got to test them, see what turns out. But again, it's very reliable. So once you know it, fine. But on top of all the colorants that is available, you can also mix them. So that's what a lot of potters doing. Mixing, for example, Copper Carbonate with a bit of Red Iron Oxide can produce really good results. Or the Copper Carbonate with some tin. Or, there's endless possibilities. I don't do that much because the way that I mostly use them is under and over glazes. So I'm already combining many of them on the surface of the pot, so to speak. So I do sort of combine them. I just don't combine them in the actual wash. But if I was using them for highlighting the textures in a pot, I would definitely do that. John Britt's books, wonderful glazing books, by the way. He have a mid-fire book, he have a high-fire book. Recommend both of them, depending on how you fire. He have a lot of really good wash mixes. Some traditional Japanese washes that are really good, that are used a lot for wood fire, where I brush it on to a pot with a lot of textures, wash it off, and then apply a very thin layer of glaze. And then do the wood fire, lots of flames, lots of ashes, and these combined washes highlight the grooves in such a beautiful way. Typically in a very dark color, but it's so perfect. But the way I use it, mixing it with glazes, I really don't need to do that. So it was a short video, but I hope in combination with my other videos about how I use this, it's still useful. So if you haven't seen them, please go ahead. I have a couple of them, and I will definitely do more. If you have any comments or any questions, please make a comment below. And please subscribe. It helps me, it encourages me to do more. And also you will get notified every time there's a new video. In general, I put out a new video now every Sunday and have been doing that for quite a while. So you can rely on that. Sometimes during first part of the day, US time, late part of the day, European time, I will put out a new video. Sometimes it's a little bit shorter like this one. Sometimes it's a very long video, like the last one I put out about throwing big pots. I think it was almost 1.5 hours. I'm sorry, but it is a lot of work, but I will put out new content constantly. So I hope to see you very soon again. Have a great day.